All right, let's just get right into it. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're conducting a literal forensic autopsy on what is, without a doubt, the most notorious trap from the summer 2026 CFOP exam. If you are anywhere near the world of sustainability reporting and assurance, this is a case study you absolutely cannot afford to ignore. We're going to break down question 6, a question that completely derailed thousands of candidates.
4%. Out of everyone who sat for this notoriously rigorous professional exam, only the dismal 4% managed to pass this specific question. Just let that sink in for a second. 96% of people looking at this exact scenario failed to navigate it successfully. It immediately begs the question, right? What went so disastrously wrong? What were the hidden traps in this case study that almost everyone missed?
And we've got the receipts. Looking at the official examiner's comments report, you can see the sheer scale of the devastation. While other questions saw pass rates hovering somewhere around 40 to 60%, question 6 sits completely isolated at that staggering 4% mark. Today we're going to investigate this bloodbath, unpacking the two parts of the question that tested both IFRS S2 transition plans and ethical independence standards.
So, Section 1, Unpacking the Transition Plan.
Let's kick things off with the first half of this brutal question. It centers around a company called Connect Telecom Limited, or CTL, and their big, flashy corporate climate initiative. We need to unpack exactly what they promised and why it totally fell apart under professional scrutiny. In their sustainability report, CTL included a whole section called Our Path to Net Zero, and in it, management made this super ambitious commitment. Reduce absolute Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2035, aligned with a 1.5 degrees C pathway. They also talked about a phased replacement of legacy equipment and installing on-site renewables. Now, on the surface, if you're just reading a press release, this looks like a fantastic, totally standard corporate initiative. It sounds proactive, right?
Okay, so here is the million-dollar question. Why on earth does this plan completely fail the IFRS S2 reporting standard? It's time to put on our rigorous auditor hats. We have to look past the slick PR language and spot the glaring compliance gaps. Because under IFRS S2, a transition plan requires actual substance to allow users to assess its credibility.
Well, here's how fast a shiny corporate promise unravels when you actually measure it against the standard. These are the fatal deficiencies that 96% of candidates completely missed. First off, there were no specific resources allocated to the mitigation initiatives. Second, they gave a 2035 target, sure, but absolutely no interim milestones to actually track their progress. Third, the key assumptions and dependencies underlying the plan, completely missing. Fourth, the financial effects of implementing this transition weren't explained at all. And finally, the link between this big plan and their actual capital allocation was totally unclear.
Moving right along, Section 2, Missing the Financial Link.
We really need to dig into the core reason why IFRS S2 disclosures even exist in the first place. Basically, they're there to connect sustainability goals directly to hard, verifiable financial realities. And this side-by-side comparison is where the illusion completely shatters. On the left, we have CTL's stated ambition. They plan to phase out legacy network equipment and install on-site renewable energy systems at their data centers. Sounds great. But on the right, we have CTL's harsh reality. Their approved capital expenditure program for the next 3 financial years has exactly 0 specific allocation for these emissions reduction initiatives. Their budget is entirely focused on current commercial and network expansion priorities. So they're out here promising a green revolution, but they haven't funded a single cent of it in their near-term budget.
And beyond just the missing money, there are some really severe hidden gaps here. Step 1, missing assumptions. CTL didn't disclose their timeline for rolling out these renewables, nor did they disclose their assumed rate of grid decarbonization in the regions they actually operate in. Step 2, missing dependencies. They totally failed to identify external factors outside their control, like, whether energy-efficient network hardware is even commercially available at the scale they need. And step 3, missing progress updates. The text literally says they are reinforcing a previous commitment, which obviously means this was disclosed last year. Yet they failed to provide any quantitative or qualitative progress updates on what they actually achieved since that last report.
So what's the ultimate takeaway for this first half? Basically, under IFRS S2, a target without a financial plan, interim milestones, or allocated resources is just an empty promise. Primary users of financial reports literally cannot assess whether CTL's commercial model is compatible with its 2035 commitment, nor can they assess if the company has any credible path to actually paying for this transition.
All right, Section 3, the Assurance Ethical Minefield.
Okay, let's completely shift gears here. The second half of question 6 leaves the telecom company behind and instead zeroes in on the ethical boundaries of the assurance firm itself, AGA & Co. This is where we step into a massive ethical minefield regarding professional independence. To really grasp the trap here, we first need to clearly define a critical concept from the International Ethics Standards for Sustainability Assurance, or IESES. A self-review threat is the risk that a firm will not appropriately evaluate the results of a previous judgment made or a service performed by its own personnel. Put simply, you cannot mark your own homework. Keep this exact definition front and center as we look at what AGA & Co. did.
So during the pre-engagement risk assessment for a client named Sphere Telecom Limited, we find out that AGA & Co. actually provided 2 prior advisory services. Service A consisted of Scope 3 awareness sessions. Now these were purely informational. They just explained the concept of Scope 3 and what peer companies were doing. Service B, however, was the development of a customized emission factor selection matrix for the client. This is calculative. It directly shapes how the client calculates their actual greenhouse gas emissions.
Which brings us to Section 4, the self-review threat. Let's look at exactly how these 2 very different services create entirely different ethical obligations under the standards, and why failing to separate them cause massive point deductions for basically everyone. If we pull up the examiner's comments for question 6 part B, they explicitly noted that while examinees generally identified the self-review threat, most of them did not distinguish between the 2 distinct services and instead just provided a generic response. They just listed out multiple threats without ever explaining how they actually arose from the specific facts of the case.
Now, I noticed that Service A, those awareness sessions, that didn't actually create a massive independence threat because it was just purely informational. AGA & Co. didn't calculate anything or make any real decisions for management. To handle this, they simply needed to apply standard safeguards. You document the prior relationship in the acceptance file. You require an independent quality control partner review. And you make sure to exclude the personnel who gave the training from the actual assurance team. Pretty simple, standard procedure, right?
But then we have Service B, the emission factor selection matrix. And this one delivers an absolute fatal blow. Because this matrix directly shapes the sustainability information that AGA & Co. is now being asked to assure. A massive self-review threat is created. And here is the absolute crucial point. Sphere Telecom Limited is a listed entity, which makes it a public interest entity, or PIE. Under ISASA, for a PIE sustainability assurance client, a self-review threat of this nature simply cannot be eliminated. There is no safeguard in the world that can reduce it to an acceptable level.
Finally, let's wrap this up with Section 5, Essential Practitioner Takeaways. Let's synthesize this whole forensic investigation into some actionable real-world lessons. We've seen just how easy it is to stumble into the traps of vague corporate reporting and super complex ethical conflicts. So here's the exact roadmap you need to follow going forward. If you encounter a vague transition plan like the one we saw from Connect Telecom, your standard is IFRS S2, and your required action is to demand the disclosure of CapEx links, assumptions, and funding sources. On the flip side, if you encounter prior calculative advisory work, like that emission matrix for a listed client, your standard is IESSA. And your required action, you literally must withdraw from the engagement entirely or potentially bring in an external firm to completely reperform the matrix. You absolutely cannot just apply a safeguard and move on.
And that brings us to the end of our analysis. I want to leave you with a really critical question to ask yourself about the reports you read and write every single day. Are your sustainability commitments actually grounded in financial reality? And is your assurance truly ethically independent? That 4% pass rate tells us that most people struggle to answer this correctly. Make sure you aren't one of them. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep looking closely at the details.